Well, hello, and welcome to the fifth session of our Bible study series. This one is a little unusual because this is not a live recording. Um, the live recording was basically fine, but we had a few sound problems because the internet wasn't great. So I'm recording another version so that what goes onto YouTube is a nice clean copy. So on that note, let's get started. So the outline for tonight is roughly as follows. First of all, we're going to look at what the church teaches about creation, because as Catholics, we follow what the church has been teaching. The church has been working on this for 2,000 years, and we read the Bible within the context of the church. We don't make it all up on our own. Then we're going to go on and think about how to approach the book of Genesis and its creation accounts. How are we meant to think about that? And then we're going to look at creation in Genesis 1 compared to some of the Babylonian creation myths, because I think that helps to explain things somewhat. And Genesis 2 and 3 are actually going to be in a separate video as a little bonus content, which I didn't really have time for in the live session, but I'm going to add a separate video for that. So keep an eye out for that. So that's the plan, and off we go. So just a quick recap of the first three chapters of Genesis. You probably know that Genesis 1 is the 6-day creation, 6 days because God rests on the seventh. And that's an incredibly famous bit of the Bible. Genesis 2 and 3 really belong together, and they're one single account. But they're split into two chapters in the Bible. Genesis 2 tells us about the creation of Adam and then Eve, man and woman, and Genesis 3 is about the fall, what we call the fall. So that event which first separated humans from God and created original sin. This video is mostly going to look at Genesis 1. We're not going to stray very much into the Genesis 2 and 3. I'll do that in the bonus video. But we do have to mention Genesis 2 particularly because we've got these two different creation accounts. The version, what we get in Genesis 1 is different to the account in Genesis 2 and 3. They're clearly different stories, and they're not always consistent, which is interesting and has created problems for people. Because when you look at Genesis 1, animals are created first and then man. If you look at Genesis 2, man is created first and then animals. So what's going on there? Did the Bible get it wrong? Is it all a fabrication? What's happening? Another thing that is a sort of an obvious difficulty for people. In Genesis 1 verse 3, God creates light. One of the most famous verses in the Bible. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. But it's not until 13 verses later in 1:16 that God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars. So very understandably, people ask, well, where's the light coming from? So that's an interesting thing, and we'll look at that particularly later on in this session. And of course, these problems or difficulties, apparent difficulties really, with the account of Genesis mean that the scientific theory of evolution is often thought to have replaced Genesis. Genesis is often characterized as a fable or a myth, and that we've got science, so we don't need that anymore. The theory of evolution, just to briefly remind anyone who wants a reminder, this states that life started off from single-celled organisms, something like an amoeba, and over millions of years evolved into different things. So you've got all kinds of plants, you've got insects, fish, birds, mammals, and of course human beings. So this is very well established scientific theory. But of course in Christian circles there is controversy around it. And often we see things framed as this binary option. Is it six-day creation or is it evolution? Which one is true? It can't both be true. It's often how it's presented. So we often hear this, particularly from non-Christians, from atheists and agnostics. People say, well, evolution proves that Genesis is not true, because it can't have happened that way. We've got the science, so we know that's not what happened. This is a very materialist way of looking at things. It sort of says, only things created of matter, that's why it's materialist, only things which are made of matter are sort of true. Other things can't be true. And it probably won't surprise you to learn that the church rejects this as a wrong and mistaken point of view, because we believe in God and we believe in spiritual things. On the other hand, one also comes across people who say, well, everything in Genesis happened word for word as described, which I suppose is generally a fundamentalist or creationist point of view. Now, within the teaching of the church, you're allowed to think that. There's nothing in church teaching which really stops you from holding that view if you'd like to. I don't personally find it a very helpful view, and you'll see why as I go on. But it's considered legitimate within the church's teaching. So what does the church teach about creation? Always a good starting point. The world and all things which are contained in it, both spiritual and material, as regards their whole substance, have been produced by God from nothing. So this is from the First Vatican Council, and that means it's an infallible teaching. There's no room for debate on this, but it's probably, if you're listening to this and you're a practicing Catholic, this probably isn't very controversial, because it's the idea that God created the universe from nothing. Before the universe was, there was nothing, and God created it. It all comes from God. There's no material things that existed beforehand. So that's hopefully not a difficulty. So biological evolution is the general theory of evolution, as we saw on that earlier. There's no official teaching from the church on this. You're actually free to make up your own mind whether you think it's a good scientific theory and well-founded or not. It's not a matter of faith or morals. The church hasn't given a definitive teaching. Pius XII, in his encyclical Humani Generis, did sort of address the issue. So it's there if you're so interested. Human evolution he addresses in the same encyclical, and there he does make a particular statement. Human bodies might have evolved, but human souls are directly created by God. So we're quite able to accept the fact that human bodies evolved over the course of millennia or millions of years. I'm not a biologist, I don't remember the time frame. That's entirely, it's entirely acceptable to Catholics. But souls are created directly by God, and this is something which has sort of kind of come up before. If you go back to the ancient world in Neoplatonism, there was this idea that souls already existed before you were born, and that was rejected by the early church. So souls being created directly by God is a sort of a long-standing article of faith, but that doesn't really present a particular problem with evolution of the body, not to my mind anyway. We also, although having said we're not going to talk about Genesis 2 and 3 very much, we shall briefly say what the church says about the fall. The serpent tempting Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, because I think this helps. What the church says about this, I think, is quite helpful for how you approach all of the creation accounts in Genesis. I'll say at the outset, this is an infallible teaching. I'm going to give you a bit of the catechism. It's quoting sections from the Council of Trent and the Second Vatican Council. So again, this is an area where you don't, as faithful Catholics, we are the church's teaching is set. So the account of the fall in Genesis 3 uses figurative language, but affirms a primeval event, a deed that took place at the beginning of the history of man. Revelation gives us the certainty of faith that the whole of human history is marked by the original fault, freely committed by our first parents. So what we get here is the statement that original sin is a real thing. You know, back at the dawn of time, at the dawn of humanity, there was an event which separated humans from God, something which ruined the relation, or stopped the relationship being the way it was meant to be, the way it had been originally intended. But that Genesis 3 uses figurative language. And we're going to come back to this idea of figurative language because that's really quite important. It is the church's teaching that this is written in figurative language. So it's not meant to be taken literally as a loaded word, but it's meant to be understood as figurative language. So to explain this idea of figurative language, I plan to use strawberries, because when you look at the screen, what you're probably thinking is strawberries. Of course, there are other things that you could think when you look at this picture. If you were a scientist, a botanist perhaps, you might think, 500 grams of Fragaria ananassa, which of course is the botanical name for scientific name for strawberries. I don't know how many botanists are watching, but it's probably more likely you're thinking, delicious. Everyone likes strawberries, possibly with cream. Now, another thing which you might be thinking, if you're a very holy person, is, proof that God loves us. He gave us these delicious strawberries to eat. This is proof that God loves us. You would have to be probably a pretty saintly person for that to be your first reaction to the picture. But there's no reason you couldn't have that reaction. So these are different ways of thinking, and none of them are inherently right or wrong. They're all perfectly valid ways of thinking, but they're doing different things. So we have an everyday approach, just thinking of strawberries. We have a scientific, technical approach when we see the picture. Or we can have a personal reaction if we particularly like strawberries, or if you disliked them, you'd have a different personal reaction. Or we could have a theological reaction to strawberries. All of these are just different ways of reacting to the same thing. And we live in a society which really values scientific thinking. If you turn on the news, you'll very often hear, a new report has told us, or statistics tell us, or research tells us. We live in a society that loves science, and science is great. I mean, I couldn't be sitting here recording this and putting it on YouTube if we didn't have science. Science is fantastic. But it's only one way of approaching the world. There are other possible ways of approaching the world too, and they don't render science invalid. It's also perhaps worth mentioning that scientific thinking is a typically Greek way of thinking. If you ever did any philosophy or logic, you might have come across something like this. Socrates is a man. All men are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. There you are. Nice, easy, logical, very clear. That's great, but that's a Greek way of thinking, and it's wonderful. It's the basis of a lot of Western civilization, Western science. It's also the basis of a lot of this Greek scientific philosophical thinking. It's the basis of a lot of Catholic theology. The Catholic theology in the Catholic Church would look very different if we'd never had Plato and Aristotle, because great thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas and others integrated this sort of thing into our theology. So I'm not criticizing this at all. I think it's fantastic, but it's important to keep in mind when you're reading Genesis that Hebrew and other ancient Near Eastern thinking doesn't do this. It uses stories to explain things. Now you might think, well, the ancient Jews or Israelites were a more primitive society. Using stories to explain things is the mark of a primitive person. I don't believe that. I really don't buy that argument. And as I record this, it's coming, it's July 2020, the COVID lockdown is eased in Britain. But what movies did people watch a few months ago at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic? They watched things like the 1990s classic Outbreak, and they watched Contagion, which I think is about 10, 12 years old, something like that. Movies about pandemics, because by watching movies about what's going on, it helps people to understand, to process things. And that's not, that's just, humans react and process things through stories on a very, I think, fundamental level. And those stories, I think it's not a coincidence that that the Hebrew way of thinking is more story oriented. I think it's perhaps a more permanent way of communicating truth to humans. But I don't see there as being anything sort of simplistic or primitive in the notion that stories are given to us to communicate truths about God. To me, it makes a lot of sense. And this sort of theological way of thinking, if you take the idea of strawberries, proof that God loves us, there's an implied story in that. You've got God, you've got us, you've got something else, you've got strawberries and proof. That all suggests a little story within one sentence, a little romance almost, or not a romance really, a love story, as God's love isn't. That would be another video. But so a theological way of thinking has, I think, something inherently story-based about it, and certainly I think that's true for the writers of Genesis. I'd also offer to you, I'd also offer you a comment from St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the great doctors of the church. As a small aside, I really love this picture of him. I love the fact that he's sitting at his desk and there's Jesus and Mary raining grace upon him. I keep hoping that one of these days I might have a vision of Jesus and Mary and they might rain grace directly on me, but apparently I'm not holy enough yet, so I shall just keep sitting at my desk. That detour aside, Augustine wrote quite a bit about the start of Genesis, and just a short quote for you here. So, with the scriptures, it is a matter of treating about faith. In short, it must be said that our authors knew the truth about the nature of the skies, but it was not the intention of the Spirit of God, who spoke through them, to teach men anything that would not be of use to them for their salvation. So there's a couple of interesting things here. I think the first one is that even in Augustine's time, at the end of the Roman Empire, so about 1,600 years ago, people were already spotting sort of difficulties with Genesis. He mentions the truth about the nature of the skies, so it was more questions of cosmology than biology, though. But the same principle applies, and I think Augustine's point is an excellent one. It's not the intention of God to teach men anything that would not be of use for their salvation. That the scriptures and Genesis as well are written to help us know God and to help us be saved. They're not written as scientific textbooks. They're not written as history books. They're there to help us with our salvation. They have very theological purpose to tell us about God. So I think that's worth keeping in mind. And if you're not sure I'm right, then I would trust Augustine. Now you're probably thinking, Eddie, that's great. Please, can we talk about Genesis now? And the answer is yes. Well, almost in a moment. You probably noticed, if you've watched some of the other talks, that I love my maps. And here, just briefly to remind you, we have Babylon and Assyria. Ashur is Assyria on this map. And that region on the right, you can see in green, there's the word Mesopotamia. That was a region which was very ancient, older than the Jews and the Israelites. And it was a culture they had a lot of contact with. The Assyrians deported the northern kingdom of Israel, most of them to Assyria. Then the Jews were exiled to Babylon and eventually managed to get back to Jerusalem. And even when they weren't sort of enslaved in these places, there was a lot of contact with the culture. And there's a particular, I think, so what I'm going to sort of Babylonian mythology in particular, I think it is something which stands in sharp contrast to Genesis and the view of God in that. Now, if you've been around children at all, and if you've ever talked to children about God, one of them has probably asked you, where does God come from? And that's not a straightforward question for a Christian to answer. If you've got children, you've probably had to give them some kind of answer. But I mean, the Bible doesn't tell us where God comes from. He is. But if you were a Babylonian or a Assyrian or any other culture really apart from Israelite or Jewish in the ancient world, you had a pretty ready answer of where God came from, or the gods came from, because there were lots of them. Because they all had a creation story, and they could tell you. So the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation, exists, with a little bit of fragmentary stuff, but most of it still exists. So we have quite a good idea of the Babylonian understanding of creation. And it starts off like this. When the heavens above did not exist, and the earth beneath had not come into being, there was Apsu, the first in order, their begetter, and the demiurge Tiamat, who gave birth to them all. And then there's a few bits we're missing out, which I'm leaving out. The gods were created within them. So Apsu and Tiamat together sort of give birth to the gods. And you have this and that's how the gods come into being. You might notice the first two lines have a bit of a similarity to Genesis. There's a literary sort of similarity to there, but there's a difference in in here in the Babylonian chronicle, Babylonian epic. You know where the gods come from. And there's another very big difference. Both Apsu and Tiamat end up dead at the hands of their children. In fact, the Babylon, the Enuma Elish is exciting compared to Genesis. You have death and battles and all sorts of things. It's stuff's happening, and you've got you can see the Assyrian picture of stuff happening there. And it's worth mentioning too in the Greek and later Roman religion, because the Romans basically just borrowed the Greek gods and gave them their own names, or the Olympian ones anyway. So the Greek god Kronos became Saturn in Roman culture. And you can see here's Kronos, one of the 8 old gods, eating his children. And then, of course, in Greek and Roman mythology, the children sort of, I think, as I recall, cut their ways out of his stomach and kill him. It's bloody and it's exciting and it's violent. And it's very, very different to the account of creation in Genesis. What about the God of the Israelites then? Well, he simply is. He's transcendent. He's beyond creation. The Bible, the Genesis 1 starts off, in the beginning God created. There's no explanation of where God comes from. He's there. And he's always been there before creation. You can see how, from a biblical standpoint, we get the teaching about God creating everything from nothing. So the God of Genesis is a very different kind of God to the other gods in the cultures around the Jews. A completely different God. In fact, when you read Genesis 1, there's a real sort of sense of peace and order. You probably don't need me to tell you that nobody dies in Genesis 1. In fact, even in Genesis 3 with the fall, nobody dies. And if you look at the days, on day 1 we've got creation of light. Day 2, the creation of the heavens and the water, the sky and the water. Day 3, the creation of land and vegetation. This is a peaceful, orderly, and if you read it, it's clearly poetic as well. It's clearly written as poetry to be read aloud. You can tell by the repetitions and things. But look what happens when we get on to day 4. Something really interesting happens. Day 4, creation of the bodies of light, the sun, the moon, the stars, mirroring the first day. There's a structure here. Day 5, we get the creation of creatures of heavens and water. Birds and fish are created. So, of course, on day 6, what's created? Life on land, food, and, of course, human beings. So Genesis is telling us something about God just in the way that it's structured. And there's a piece there. It's less apparent to us because we're so familiar with the story, we take it for granted. But compared to the other cultures around the Jews and the Greeks at this time, because I should have mentioned earlier, Genesis was very likely written in the time of the Babylonian exile, or perhaps a bit afterwards, which is one of the reasons why it's sort of in reaction to this Babylonian culture. So you have this inherent peace and this order. It's created in a rational, orderly way. Let's come back to God creates light, God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars, because this has to do with the Babylonian and surrounding culture as well. we think of God creating the sun, moon, and the stars as God simply creating things which are up in the sky and which give us light or are pretty to look at if you like looking at the stars. I would like you to meet Shamash, the sun god, a god who is very popular in this region of Mesopotamia and for a long time. And there were other gods of the moon, as a god of the moon, a number of gods of the stars. So when the writer of Genesis says God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars, and actually he says that they're to light the day and the night. So what he's saying is that our God made your gods, and they're just there to be lamps to give us light. They're not, they're not really powerful. They're just, they're lampstands. That's one of these things which we read in the Bible. We don't realize what a big statement it is. And you wonder what the Babylonian next door thought about this. Did they take it in their strides? Were they offended? I don't know. But it's a very different view of God. Let's go back to the Enuma Elish for a moment and think about the creation of human beings. In this, they're actually made from the corpses of the elder gods, Apsu and Tiamat. And if we read a few lines of what it says here, the subject humans should take note and call on their gods. Since he commands them, they should heed their goddesses. Let food offerings be brought for their gods and goddesses. May they not be forgotten. May they remember their gods. And then actually 118 is just a bit fragmentary. I should have probably left that out. But you can see here the subject humans. This is not a relationship of equals in any sense. This is, human beings are there. They're from the corpses of the elder gods, and new gods see them as subjects, people who are going to bring them offerings. It's very much the relationship between a king and a servant. And it's interesting here to look at this. This is a Babylonian cylinder scroll, very old one, so long before Genesis was written. But like I mentioned earlier, the Babylonian gods were very old. So you can see here on the right is the sun god. He's got a rather wicked-looking knife in his hand, and you've got the three people bringing him an offering, as you would expect. It's a cow or an ox or something. But also notice at the bottom, he's got his foot on some poor guy. So the Babylonian gods are not they have a long history of being sort of kingly, and there's not really a lot of gentleness about them. Now, when we look at Genesis, I think things are a little bit different. So Genesis 1:27, God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So first of all, just to mention that Adam, the Hebrew word, just means humankind. It's not a proper name yet. Just means human being, humankind. You notice the repetition of God being created, humans being created in God's image. It's mentioned twice in the first line and the second line. And that really sort of dignifies human beings. There's something divine about the human person. Whereas in the surrounding culture, humans are just the subjects of the gods, made from the discarded corpses of the gods the new ones had killed. There's an inherent dignity in this, which is absent from the culture around the Jews. It's also worth pointing out that male and female, he created them. Humanity, there's a room full of men or a room full of women in some way is a sort of an incomplete set of humankind, because it's only one sex. And it all, as if anyone needed to be told, it also, I think, shows quite clearly that both men and women are created in the image of God. It seems almost redundant to say that, but perhaps it is good to mention. So there is a sort of a dignity to both the human beings in general and men and women separately, which is there in the creation. Another thing to look at is what God says to them after he's created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." Well, again, that's very different to the Babylonian conception. These aren't subjects. These are humans are being given a authority to govern the earth, to govern it well, to be stewards over it, to subdue it, to have dominion. They're not slaves. They're junior partners in a relationship with God Almighty, but certainly not slaves or subjects. So again, this very honoured role of humanity. This is a sort of role which is given to demigods in some of the Mesopotamian mythology, not humans. So God blessed them. Yes. So the other thing to mention here: be fruitful and multiply. So on one level, that's clearly that clearly means that sex is a good thing within the boundaries of a marriage. Christians have always understood Adam and Eve as the first married couple, so that sex is something which is a positive and encouraged by God within those within that boundary. However, be fruitful and multiply is not an instruction which is purely limited to humans in Genesis. We'll come back to that. Then the Lord God formed man from the earth and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. So this is from Genesis 2, one of the few bits we're looking at from Genesis 2 now. You might notice I've put the Hebrew in square brackets, Adam from Adama. So there's a bit of a pun here. So man is made from the earth. He is an earthling, not in the sense that he's made out of earth. But God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And in Hebrew, the word is ruah, and in the Greek translation, it's pneuma. And both those words, both the Greek and the Hebrew, mean either breath or spirit. So we could also say God inspirited his spirit of life into man, which is perhaps another way of sort of saying that he made God made man in his own image. And it's a very dignified conception of humanity. There's something of God in us. He's given us. So to say a little bit about Genesis 1 and evolution, then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good. So it's not just humans who go forth and multiply. The earth puts forth vegetation. The earth happens twice. We get 3 references to seed. Clearly, there's a sense here in which the ongoing process of creation is sort of delegated. God isn't creating it directly. He's letting the earth bring forth vegetation and seeds so that more things will grow. Similarly, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures. Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things and wild animals of the earth of every kind. And so it was. So again, you see within the narrative of Genesis 1, there's a sort of secondary creation going on here. Once God's created the world, the earth and the waters, those bring forth more things. So personally, I see this as working really quite well with the scientific theory of evolution. I don't see anything myself in Genesis that contradicts it. In fact, I think the two are quite harmonious. Your views might differ, of course, but I see them as quite compatible. Okay, so to sum up what we've been talking about, important to say, church teaching is human souls are created by God. But I don't think that's too controversial. You're free to decide for yourself whether you accept the theory of evolution. I'm not a scientist, but I know scientists and they seem to think it's entirely reasonable. To me, it seems to work perfectly well with the account in Genesis, but people are free to decide for themselves. More importantly still, Genesis was written to help people know God, not to be a scientific or historical text. And it does help us to know about God, particularly when I think you look at it in the context of the other ancient religions of the time. It really differs quite markedly. So I hope that's been interesting. Thank you very much for your attention, and there will be a little bonus video coming up with some stuff on Genesis 2 and 3, the creation of Adam and Eve and the fall. And the usual thank you to Becky and Marisha for their technical support.